Hello, my name is Calcagno, and I'm a poet, a writer, and an educator who lives and works in Chicago. I am hoping whoever is receiving this video is well, healthy, and happy wherever they are in the world. I'm really excited to be able to utilize this virtual platform to talk about a topic in poetry that is interesting and interests me, and to delve into some poems and analyze them, or some things that they're doing really, really well. And so the topic I'm going to talk to you all about is the idea of spacing in poetry. So white space, if you will. And the reason why white space is interesting to me, because I grew up always thinking that poems had to be beautiful, that poems had to look one way on the page. And growing older and delving deeper into my craft as a poet, I started to realize those poems that deviated from that idea or that norm were really dope, and or the poems that I was drawn to. And I truly think that it's not just what the poem is saying, but the way it's positioned on a page, or positioned in general, is asking us as readers, as listeners even, to pay attention to what is not being said. So we're going to delve right in, and I'm just going to define the way that I'm thinking about white space or spacing. And so I'm thinking about white space, and my working definition is the unmarked parts of the page. So if we're thinking about a poem, whatever is around it with no words. And we're also going to talk about or see some poems that even the space around it is not white. And so just spacing, right? White or otherwise. And so the space around the poem and the visual breathing room. And this is not my own term, but a term that I have seen used is the visual breathing room. So what that essentially means is, when we're looking at a poem and the parts around the page that are unmarked, is evoking us as readers, as listeners, to have breathing room in how we're speaking or performing that poem or reading that poem, and know that there is some idea of breath happening. So us evoking or having that poem evoke breath, evoke pause, and also understanding that the white space around the poem, or the unmarked space in that poem, being a frame, and how it is also evoking awareness. Poems are asking us to pay attention to it. And so even some poems, I flipped around and just saw, this is Julian Randall, to refuse. So the space around it, we're not going to read every single poem the same way, and we need to understand that. And so, how is the content and the form in conversation with one another? So these are poems that, might not have been the poem that we were all introduced to, those poems that are experimenting with the idea of spacing. But these are poems that are screaming to us, like, pay attention, not just to the words, but how they're positioned. Pay attention to how I, as a poem, am asking you to read me out loud. So I'm going to start by sharing a quote from NourbeSe Philip, because I'm using one of Philip's poems, and I find it important and valuable to be able to share this quote. moving beyond the content, the political can also be present in the form. This creates distance between students and the political elements of form because there isn't necessarily something explicit for students to point to as political. And so essentially, what does the form or utilization of spacing or white space or breathing room on the page, how does that evoke us? How does that evoke meaning? And there are some questions that I'm going to also walk you all through, questions that I point to or ask myself whenever I am about to analyze a poem. And what Philip is saying essentially is the form itself, the way that a poem is positioned, white space, it can also be asking us that question as well. That distance created between content and words on the page, that is helping us understand what else is not there. Not just the words themselves, not just the content, utilizing form. And in this sense, Philip has utilized, and I've seen Philip utilize so much white space. That's political. And that it is also is equally as valuable as the words themselves. So Philip's collection, Zong, is a phenomenal collection, very political collection. Zong #1, I will not read this out loud. I will actually play a sound clip of a myriad of voices reciting this poem out loud. And thinking about even the way the poem is positioned on the page itself. The first question I would say, or ask rather, is what meaning is being made? And back to Philip's quote, it's not always the content that's going to help us get there. It's the form itself. The position, the way that the poem is positioned might help us evoke some meaning or get towards some meaning. Second question I would ask is, what is being constrained? How would we look at this poem and ask the question of constraint, and how close things might be together, close words or letters. And it's not too much closeness, not too much constraint. If you think about a poem being completely left aligned, like we see many poems, or traditional poems rather, in that sense, those poems might be very constrained, but this poem is literally broken apart. And so the next question I would ask is, how is this poem breaking free? What is free in this poem? This poem is literally stretched and broken apart. How might that be political? How might that help us evoke some meaning? Another question I would ask is, what is being asked of us and how to read this poem? And so I'll play a clip in a second to help us understand maybe how one might read this and how that can help evoke some meaning. But let's identify, what is this poem saying? And so you'll see W's. There are lots of W's towards the beginning. We can identify the word water between the second and third lines. So a word is broken apart, a word is not. So it seems like words might not be appearing, or the same word might not appear on the same line. Interesting choice, and how that is appearing. I'm identifying another word, hour. I'm identifying some repetition of the word water. So water is not appearing in the same ways. Okay, and so I'm also identifying the word day. Seems like some sounds, so words that might not be actual words. So it sounds like sound is being evoked here. So let's play. Okay. So the sound of that reading helps kind of evoke the many different layers of this story. And what is being made in terms of meaning is the idea of understanding the slave trade, a history of people and their connection or relationship to the water. And so Zong, the collection, explores that pretty deeply in the many different lines of history and the threads of narrative. And so what we do see in this poem here is like a physical drowning. And so from thinking about my analysis of the idea of breaking free, what is free and what is constrained. So people, a history of a people being constrained and literally breaking free in this poem. And so the use of that form is political in that sense. The use of that, this spacing on the page, and even the positionality of words and letters and repetition and evoking sound, not just out loud with breath, but even on the page, the physical drowning, as if folks are drowning. And so very interesting and very phenomenal use of spacing and white space. And so we're going to move on into another poem. But beforehand, I do want to share a quote from Orlando White. And that functional white guides the reader through a text. White space allows text to exist in a specific position on the page in relation to the background. And perhaps that background is the throat of paper, inhaling language and exhaling sound and silence. And that is from Orlando White's essay, Functional White, Crafting Space and Silence. And so why that is really valuable is thinking about what is the page's role? And the page's role, I think, as we saw in NourbeSe Phillips' Zong #1, is to be able to be a platform, a space that is helping in evoking meaning, but also helping with breath work, helping with how far can you actually stretch and break free. not just in positionality, but also in the reading and the performance. And so I'm going to share another poem, which is George W. Bush, 2001, by Carl Andre. And again, just asking that question and thinking of those questions of what meaning is being made, the idea of freedom and constraint, the ideas of breaking free and the performance and breath work. So thinking about all of these things, the first thing I would take note of is the positionality of this poem and how it reminds me personally of a crossword puzzle, and how you're identifying words and circling words. And so just even the idea of being constrained in a physical box, the constraint. So very experimental, different than Philip's experimentation with spacing. But this spacing, right, like what we do need to take note of, not left aligned. It's physically constrained in a box, so it is boxed in. What is that telling us metaphorically? The idea of how we're even supposed to read it. Again, thinking back to Zong number 1, Philip's Zong number 1, and how words are kind of flowing into the next lines, okay? So George W. Bush is the smiling face of the boot heel of America. Okay. So I'm thinking to myself, what is this poem asking me of reading, right? Like, or am I flowing into the next line? Why is it that it's asking me this certain breath work, the idea of flowing into the next line and flowing, okay? And so I'm thinking about, if we do have to also know in relation to the title itself, what politics are here, what underlying storyline is not present. Is the box telling me? The box is telling me something, but also the content, boot heel of America, smiling face. What is a boot heel evoking? What is a smiling face evoking? What is the constraint and the boxing in evoking? So there is a lot here. And so thinking about freedom, is this poem able to break free from a box? Probably not. So there's a lot more constraint than there is freedom. Okay, so just thinking about the differences of the spacing of the page itself. But even though we do have to note that the poem is a little bit broken apart, not as broken apart as Zong number 1, but it is broken apart in that everything is equal distance. To me, it kind of seems like a very surface, like we want to appear pretty, but everything is not very pretty. Okay. So thinking about those things. I'm also thinking about white space as an idea of resistance, and how it is resisting the idea of needing to look a certain way, but also form as resistance in relation to content. Thinking about the past, this poem and the previous poem being poems that are evoking a lot of history and politics. And so why utilize spacing or experimenting with the idea of the page and breaking apart poems in a particular way as a form of resistance? Something to note, something to think about. I'm noticing that a lot of poems that I'm bringing up today do have a lot of relation to politics or populations of people. So erasure poems is a form a lot of folks use by taking a text that already exists and marking out or paying closer attention to specific words in that text to create an underlying poem. And so Nina Polari used a form N400 to be able to construct a poem, so an erasure poem. And N400 of that form is an application utilized to become a naturalized citizen in the United States. And so it's a poem that I saw in a workshop, and I just thought it was incredible. Going back to my working definition of white space. So it is also important to note that the space around a poem might not always be white, and I'm thinking about erasure poems being a great example of that. It's actually darker in the background and calling a lot of attention to the words. So the words themselves kind of have that white space, and so it kind of pops out in a different way opposed to the other poems that we looked at and analyzed. So this form N400 is the background of this poem. And so I'm just going to zoom in a little bit for us to kind of see. And so asking that question, what meaning is being constructed? And so the form itself, even though we can't physically see the background or the space around, so that white space, if you will, we can't physically see that, but that is evoking meaning just by simply knowing that is what is underneath. That is what is helping us construct these words being brought to us as content. So the form and the content are marrying each other, just inevitably, okay? And so what is being asked of us in terms of breaking free and what is constrained? To me, it seems like the physical act, before we even read the poem, the physical act of marking out a background of a form that has meaning and holds meaning in itself, in a literal sense, is constructing a poem, is breaking free of whatever connotations there are, as someone who is in relation to this form. Okay, and asking the idea of breath work, what pausing and what sense of speed is being evoked and how we might read this. Okay, so what is being asked of us in our own breath work and as we read out loud or listen. So, do you have awful associations? Have you been in total terror? Yes. No. If you ever claim in writing or any other way to have country, no. Have no country. Apologies. Are you confined? This poem is absolutely incredible in thinking about the careful choice of words and trying to map out content, storyline. And so the physical distance even between the rest of the content here, and the physical distance, even how the tone being evoked, being very dark, very heavy, very sinister in a way, it seems. And again, thinking about poems being constructed and how we are experimenting with spacing, how a lot of these poems don't have a lot of content. If it were all left aligned and put into stanzas or constructed into stanzas, very small space being taken up. And just the heaviness of the space used and what is actually here. And so truly, truly incredible and an interesting way to be able to utilize erasure as a point of helping evoke understanding of what is being explored. And so if we are thinking about what meaning is being made, meaning being made of a form that holds a lot of political connotation, a lot of understanding of what is the relationship between a person to this form, someone going through this naturalization process. And so the idea of constraint, wanting to break free from maybe a country or a space, for thinking about the questions being asked. There's attention to detail to the questions. Do you have awful associations? It's not necessarily the question that the form holds, but the question that that is being brought to the surface. And thinking back to Philip saying the form being a way to play around with the politics, or the form being able to help us understand what is not there. This form has several questions, and Polari being able to construct her own questions. Have you been in total terror? Yes or no? If you ever claim in writing or any other way to have no country, are you confined? And so asking the hard questions of association with a native land or a new land, and that in itself is such a phenomenal use of art and space. So I'm going to move on to a poem by Danez Smith, and actually have the poem here, and I will show you all just what this poem actually looks like in a book, because online it looks very different. And so Don't Call Us Dead is this collection here. Beautiful collection, and what Danez Smith is exploring, they're exploring the idea of relationship to the body in this collection. And so not just the relationship to the body as gender-wise or racially as a Black person, but the relationship to the body in terms of being HIV positive. And the poem we're going to explore in this is Litany with Blood All Over. And so this is what the poem looks like on the actual page. I'll just share my screen online so you all can read it along with me in a better way. Just as we're noticing the relationship to words and page, how much spacing is occurring, okay? And so a litany has some religious connotation to it. A litany is kind of like a prayer or a psalm utilized in church or, with religious practices. And so litany also might have a lot of repetition. So very sing-songy, right? And so I love this poem. The title, Litany with Blood All Over. I mean, that is telling you, right? If we're thinking about what meaning is being made or being, evoked, we can kind of realize there's some stuff here. And so I think this poem, we're thinking about spacing is an idea of resistance to help support meaning. This definitely, I think, hits home and constructing the idea of silence or pause or breath. Kind of does a lot of different things. And so, I was thinking about, before I'll read it out loud, but just thinking about too the idea of the litany with repetition, what is being repeated and how that's kind of helping us kind of understand meaning, the construction of meaning, and how much space is between each next phase, and even the kind of zigzagging. Okay, litany with blood all over. I am telling you something. I got blood on the brain. The prettiest fish are poisonous, and same is true for men. Test results say I talk too much. Test results say I ask none of the right questions. Test results have the blues. Test results say I'm a myth, proven true, and by effect, boring. Zeus proved just a boy playing with the lights. Test results say my name is not my name, and test results say my name is banned from the radio. The test results say I am the father of my own end, and I am a deadbeat. I let the blood raise my boy. I let the blood bury him too. I let the blood do what I have always failed to do and end the boy for good. Blood and its endless screaming or singing or whatever people do when their village burns. Again, the blood and its clever songs. All I desire surrenders. Have I no venom? Again, I have too many words for sadness. I touched the stove and the house burned down. I touched the boy and now I have his name. Our blood wedding, our blood funeral. I'm his new wife at dusk, and by morning I'm his widow. He left me his blood, and though he is not dead, I miss my husband. I hate my husband. He left me with child. I cut his awful seed out of me, but it always grows back. The child comes half dead, calls me mother, then dies, and joins his brothers. My veins, rivers of my drowned children, my blood thick with blue daughters. My blood, his blood, my blood, his blood, my blood, his blood, and so on and so forth. just taking a moment to be able to soak in how space changed throughout the course of this poem. You kind of see over time the story being told. You know, the litany, right? It's very sing-songy, very prayer, hymn-like. You get a sing-songy sense at the beginning, but over time, it changes. The tone is changing. And how do we understand or see that, not just with the content, but with the page itself and how the page is physically changing? I'm just gonna scroll and just, you all kind of see the river-like flow. Very much like a river, until it's not. Or it is, I don't know. So you see the content is talking of the blood of the body and how the blood is, you know, the blood is this, the blood is that. Here's my relationship to the blood, to the test in the blood, to my body and others and blood. And you know, blood is kind of, you know, moving like a river through the body, you know, the blood being the thing that is helping us stay alive. Or, you know, what is the heart pumping? It's pumping blood. And so it's kind of moving all the time. And so Smith is getting at that in the relationship to the page. But when we get to my blood, his blood, we're seeing a crossover. The blood is beautiful until it's not. The blood is beautiful, or this river, this thing keeping me alive, until it is chaotic. And so with the idea of this crossover, it could have continued in the river-like motion on the page. But what is this saying? What meaning is this making? My blood is chaos. My blood is a violent thing, or my blood is a heavy thing. My blood and his blood is even if you're noticing, it's not just my blood, his blood kind of typed over one another. It's broken apart. My blood, his blood, Y blood, Y blood, Y blood, Y blood, Y blood. It is saying so much, and the attention that it's bringing. And so I'm thinking about the role of the space in holding this. The page is holding all of this, the role of this breath around this chaos, to hold this physical notion of chaos, of heaviness, of body. Is the blood resisting, or is the page resisting? Is this blood breaking free, or blood being contained? And so these questions are important to be able to understand the meaning, but also not just the meaning, but the idea of the act of resisting and breaking free and writing, and the positionality. You know, we've seen so many political poems, and the body and existence, the several intersections of Smith's identity here is being a political act, and politicizing the blood. And so, how does one read this out loud? So what breath work is being asked of us to kind of speak out loud the chaos? And that might look very differently per voice, per relationship to such a poem. Similar to Philip's recording of Zong 1, the several different layers, it is very evident the physical layering of the word blood and the spacing and the breaking free and constraint here, that there are so many different layers, and that might be many different voices and sounds. So, all right. We're going to jump into our last poem, which is Kaveh Akbar's Recovery. And similar to how I showed you that poem, Dennis Smith's poem, I'm going to show you Kaveh Akbar's poem Recovery and Calling a Wolf, just to see how small of a poem this is. Nope, realize I have to stop sharing. Just to see how small of a poem this is on this page, okay? And the reason I'm showing how tiny of a poem this is due to the fact we have seen several experimental poems. And I don't think someone would look at this and say this is a very experimental poem, very different from Zong. Very different than Litany with Blood All Over. But the tininess and realizing this space is also calling out to us as readers to say, pay attention to what I'm telling you here, not just here. Okay, and if you are familiar with Calling a Wolf, you'll understand that this collection is about Akbar's relationship to alcoholism and recovery and what those identities have done for him over time. And so any person kind of dealing with recovering or finding help will understand that those things are a process. And so the reason I'm showing you this poem, Recovery, is because spacing doesn't always have to be super unconventional or experimental. Spacing can also do valuable work, even with a poem such as this. And so, I'll share my screen. Okay, Recovery. First, setting down the glass, then the knives. Black resin seeps into the carpet. According to science, I should be dead. Liptus table, unsteady boat, drifts away. Angostura, agave, elderflower, rye. The whole paradisal bouquet spins apart. Here, I am graceless. No, worse than that. So we've seen in how this appears in the books very small and takes up so little space. It's a left-aligned poem. And what is important in asking the question of positionality is, why take up such little space, right? And so what is the poet's relationship to this content, this story? And why so small? And thinking about recovery as a process is something that occurs over time. Even I'm thinking as I read out loud, this poem is asking me to pay special attention to the detail of every little bit, taking my time and reading out loud. And that's what it feels like for me. and how much space is occurring around the poem, and that so much space has yet to happen or to be taken up. Recovery might be a small portion of that life, right? And so, so much is yet to come. And so these are the things that I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about the idea of process taking time. Process is time. And so thinking about even the process of, kind of this little step of every little detail and ingredient to make a drink, and how so much is occurring, starting to, even starting with the word first. You think about the time it takes to make a drink or a meal or anything, right? And so their first step is second step, third step, right? And so this poem is occurring in that matter. Might not say first, second, or third, but even the little bits, right, of the spacing between. It's going to take you a while to get to the next part. Okay, and so I think it's interesting and fascinating in how this poem is occurring over time. You wouldn't want to read this fast. You wouldn't want, and Akbar is probably realizing this doesn't make sense to take up an entire page, and that there is time occurring. And so the breathing room around is framing this as a notion of silence. Maybe shame is in that silence. It's framing pause, and maybe I'm not sure about this being a poem of urgency at all. But maybe the urgency behind telling this story, but not necessarily the framing of breath being a thing that is urgently speaking this poem, but taking the little bits, just drawing you in, is what I'm getting, and how this poem is appearing. So those are the poems that I have. I do want to share a quote from Gwendolyn Brooks' Young Poets Primer, which is making me think about these poems all wrapped up together in the same vein of utilizing this form of spacing and white space, or breathing room. And writing your poem, tell the truth as you know it. Tell your truth. Don't try to sugar it up. Don't force your poem to be nice or proper or normal or happy if it does not want to be. Remember that poetry is life distilled, and that life is not always nice or proper or normal or happy or smooth or even-edged. And sharing that as an ending point to conclude what variations of poems that we've seen today around this topic, it's important to realize that the truth is so much outside of the content as well. You know, how the page is physically holding your poem has its truth of its own. And I hope that you all enjoyed walking through these poems together and asking those questions of these poems together. And I hope, again, that folks are well and writing. and take care.